Okay, it's okay. So good afternoon. Thank you very much for accepting this new invitation. Glad to meet you again, Dr. Pierre Morgan. Can we talk about today about the vaccine value chain components at COVID era? Do you think that there's any change in the value chain components right now, or no? That's the same. That's a traditional value chain.
Well, I mean, certainly there has been changes all along the value chain when you think about it, because number one, the technologies that made it first to the finish line as registered vaccines, other than the inactivated viruses from China, all the other technologies were novel technologies. RNA was never registered as a vaccine before. It was developed, it was under development for decades, or at least one decade in cancer, but it had not been approved as a commercial product. And viral vectors were maybe a bit more advanced, maybe a few more years of development, but also same story, very few approved products. So I would say at the very beginning of the value chain, you have new technologies. And when you say new technologies, it means new manufacturing processes, potentially new equipment, new reagents. Case in point being the enzymes that are being used for RNA, whether the capping enzyme or the T7 polymerase, which now are used in routine manufacturing processes, and we're only in process development before the registration of those products. Which explains also why, at such an early stage, when you have novel technologies that are not yet scaled to produce massive amounts of products, that it is so difficult to transfer the technology, because you have very few people who know what they're talking about. You get a very small pool of trained personnel who are familiar with the processes and know how to execute it in a consistent manner. I would say the central part of the what is called secondary manufacturing, formulation, filling, and finishing, especially the filling and finishing, it was not very different. You're still looking at injectables, still similar type of equipment. I think the primary difference with the situation prior to the pandemic is the stress, the pressure on this part of the value chain, because simply the throughput has to be much bigger than what it was before, and there's a bottleneck at that level, with the bottleneck also in terms of supplies, supply of vials, supply of rubber stoppers, of caps, and so on and so forth. Everything is in short supply. And then downstream, you had a few changes in the value chain, in the so-called distribution and logistics part, with the different requirements in terms of cold chain. Vaccines that require freezing or even deep freezing are raising logistic issues that are completely different. It's a different order of magnitude in terms of complexity, in terms of ability to access people, especially in remote locations, to the point that it's been limiting their use in countries where the infrastructure was in place or where it could be set up reliably. So overall, as you can see, to me, the entire value chain has been seeing some changes that are directly correlated with the nature of the technologies and the requirements that they have.
Okay, thank you very much. I have two questions. The first of them is about the novel technologies. To whom they belong, these new technologies? Do all of the companies, biotech companies, they can have access to these technologies, or it is, just it belongs to the producer, to the inventor, to the innovator? Can they buy it, or can they share it with each other? How do they use it? Who can have access to these new technologies?
Well, typically when a new technology emerges, it starts either from a company that does research or it comes from an academic center.
Mhm.
And then typically, if it's true innovation, if the innovativeness is recognized by the patent authorities, then you have fresh intellectual property, and then that sort of restricts the number of players who can access the technology. It's either you sign an agreement and you have a license to use the technology, or you don't and you can't use it and you have to find an alternative. So that's the nature of the nature of the situation. So I think in this specific instance, the each company has its own IP, or at least some form of IP, and in addition to the IP, there's know-how. It may be one thing to have IP that protects some parts of the manufacturing process, but on top of it, when you develop know-how on formulation or very specific steps of the manufacturing, that know-how is as precious as IP. It drives your yields, the consistency between your batches, and therefore could represent also a very strong competitive advantage. So for all those reasons, be it enshrined in IP or be it derived from know-how, the companies that have the control of those intangible assets, because that's what they are, intangible assets, they have no intention whatsoever to give them away.
Okay.
And that explains the current debate on, oh, what if there was a compulsory license and it was given to producers, God knows where, to manufacture vaccines by the truckload. I personally don't buy that for a second. I was in the pharma industry at the time of the compulsory licenses that were imposed on the manufacturers of the antiretrovirals, the HIV products. And when you're looking at small molecules that are formulated in so-called dry formulations, tablets or capsules, the level of complexity is less than it is for the production of biologics. So that's point number one. Point number two, because some of those technologies, such as RNA, use very different techniques, equipments, and reagents, the capacity is not necessarily available just anywhere. In the case of the viral vectors, it's a bit easier. You grow them on cells. So if you have biofermentation capacity, you can probably localize the production of viral vectors. But RNA, it's not the case. The second thing is personnel. When a company has been working for years in developing a manufacturing process and scaling it up, you don't transfer it by simply copying and pasting your standard operating procedure. It takes investment in capital, assuming you have the space. Okay, it takes so buying dedicated equipment. It takes training the people, the staff. If you don't have them, you have to hire them. And then it takes a validation by the regulatory authorities of the process that has been localized in a given country. So my experience is telling me that you don't transfer bulk manufacturing, meaning manufacturing of the active, the primary part of the manufacturing process, in less than 12 to 18 months. And that's assuming most of the conditions are already assembled, meaning you have space, you start from brownfield, you have a facility, utilities are already in place, you've got personnel that can be reallocated, to these facilities. You can order in a timely fashion the dedicated equipment, which is not guaranteed, and etc. So I think it's, of course, it's the corollary to your question. So the IP and the know-how is developed by the companies that are working on the on those new technologies, and when they own it, they master it. The more they practice, the better they get at it. And transferring that, the combination of the processes and the know-how, is long and complex and expensive, and therefore it is not a turnkey solution.
Yeah, but don't they need investments? Because as an example, BioNTech has collaborated with Pfizer because they were not do it alone. You know, they had to collaborate with Pfizer, but because they had you know, they had already worked on other projects together, so there were trust between them. So that's why I think, in my view, that's why they came, you know, they entered into collaborating about this. But I think if a small company, as you mentioned, or a small university lab, you know, they just have access to technology, they invent something new, they will definitely need, you know, other investors, you know, to come and participate, you know, and probably share the new invention with them. Otherwise, they can never do, you know, reach to market themselves.
Yeah, well, I think what you're alluding to is a little bit different from the point I was making. First of all, the collaboration between, you know, a relatively small company like BioNTech and a very large one like Pfizer is in a way similar in terms of drivers as the collaboration between Oxford University and AstraZeneca. Mm-hmm. When in a situation of a pandemic, you need all sorts of capabilities. You need not only manufacturing, you need also clinical operations to run a clinical study. You need medical affairs. You need regulatory affairs to approach the authorities. And therefore, large corporations that have a know-how as to how do you run large, fast and efficiently large scale clinical programs, they have, I mean, they're leveraging on that set of skills, and the same applies to other functions, which explains why, you know, mid-sized companies have when they want to do it themselves, they have a harder time compared to the big ones. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a scale effect in terms of the ability to, you know, deploy fast an extensive clinical development program, and then having a massive regulatory initiative to get the product registered, and so on and so forth. So the other thing that you're alluding to is financing. Of course, financing is important, but it's not. It's only one piece, if you will. A smaller organization, or, you know, a startup, a biotech, needs other resources than just cash. Mm-hmm. You know, if you take a startup which is freshly established from an academic team, you typically have people who are very good at the mechanism, at the you know, the understanding of the details of a pathophysiological pathway or a special mechanism of action, but they typically have no experience mm-hmm. With process development. They have no experience with regulatory toxicology. Mm-hmm. They have never discussed with the authorities, so they don't know what it means to obtain a clinical trial approval. Mm-hmm. And God forbid, they don't know how to run a clinical development program. So, which is, you know, also why the collaboration between a small player and a large player gives you this acceleration effect. You leverage the capabilities that exist at the level of the large player.
Mm. Yeah, but I wonder why the large players, they do not do everything from A to Z themselves, you know, because they have the capacity. Why they do not do this themselves?
But they may not have the innovation.
Do you think that this may change? Or this is
Well,
changing already?
the large pharma companies are not relying 100% on their own R&D
Yeah,
team
sure. Yeah.
to generate, new compounds. There's typically a team called, whether you call it business development, whether you call it external R&D. Essentially, what do these people do? They scout
Mm.
around for ideas and technologies that could be a good fit with the portfolio. So and the large companies, of course, they're using their part of their profits to acquire this innovation. And you got several ways of doing it. It can be an outright acquisition. It could be a license. It could be a co-development agreement. There are plenty of formats, if you will, to perform those tasks. But the net result is giving access to a new technology to a large company that otherwise didn't create that technology itself through its own R&D processes.
They do not create that new technology through their R&D process because they do not want to take the risk. They want to avoid the risk. Is it because of the risk taking?
Because it's simply because they didn't have the idea, or they didn't have the idea, or they do take the risk. Insofar as they run their own R&D programs, and when they acquire the rights to an early stage asset, by definition, they assume part of the risk, the entirety of the risk if they acquire the venture. So it's not necessarily a matter of appetite for risk, which is a driver. It could be, there are so many avenues to value creation and to innovation that you cannot possibly host all of them in your own R&D team.
Yeah. Because 20 years ago, I think it was different. The big companies like Sanofi, Aventis, they used to have their own R&D, but gradually they closed most of the R&D, as far as I know. So, and they just, invested in other things. And it happened through big giants, giant pharmaceutical companies. They just, outsourced innovation to other smaller companies, or, as you mentioned, the university laboratories.
Yeah. I guess what you're referring to, the R, the research part, the development part. The big pharma companies, they're good at that.
Yeah.
It's the R part, or the early stage research rather.
Yeah.
But I think among the top 20 of the pharma companies, there's only one, which, as far as I know, maybe it would stand to be verified, but only one which is not relying on external growth for innovation, which is Novo.
Okay.
All the others have some form of acquisition, licensing in, or whatever, to bring in innovation that's been invented elsewhere.
I think that by whatever we can see, and other new vaccines that will arrive to the market for COVID vaccine with other technologies. So probably this paradigm, risk-taking paradigm by the big pharmaceutical companies, this may change. They will prefer to do it themselves, to try it at least, to see it, because I think they will have more return on their investments if they do it, so it will be more profitable for them at long run, at least at long run.
Well, that's an interesting assumption. If you're assuming that the question is the cost of the royalty that you pay, milestones and royalties that you pay to the inventors, versus the costs of having a full-fledged research staff and running all the experiments. So far, it seems that the economics are more in favor of maybe keeping a few areas of research where you're super specialized and you have really good people. Anything else you outsource.
Yeah, this is when you're certain about what's going on next year. If there won't be any new pandemic, you know, if there won't be the need for new
Don't know.
treatments or vaccines. So I think that the COVID vaccine has changed a lot of things, you know, and economics. All of the economics predictions, you know, we wash them away and put them away. I personally, I'm not really fond of them because they prove that they cannot guess what may happen, you know, what are the uncertainties that may threaten the markets. So I think it has changed completely.
That has always been the problem with the I say unusual events with a large impact, which is the so-called the black swans. Okay, an event which happens, which is you know, has a very limited, very low odds of occurrence, but a very high impact in case it happens. So I guess you know, I'm going to paraphrase many authors. The question is not whether we will have a next pandemic or not. The question is when.
When?
The question is when. So I think the real question today is which insights can be derived from the current pandemic, not only in terms of science and research, but also in terms of policies, in terms of how you regulate the flows of people, how you localize manufacturing, how you create hubs of capabilities close to where the people live. For instance, you know, an idea which was already, you know, very much in favor years ago with the influenza pandemic has gained a lot of momentum, which is about the localization of manufacturing, of biologics especially, so that you have, rather than relying on a small number of large facilities, you would rely on a larger number of smaller facilities. The problem immediately becomes, okay, that all this is nice and well, but what do you do with those facilities in the inter-pandemic period? How do you keep the equipment working? How do you keep the knowledge of the people current? How do you maintain the staff? Who's paying for this? In other words, how do you create an economic model so that those hubs are actually self-sufficient and they can therefore be maintained so that they can be mobilized to produce something else in case the next pandemic strikes? Right now, I mean, I've not yet seen a convincing model to that end. Right?
Okay.
So the idea is on the table. The idea is not new. Contrary to what the current authors of this so-called new idea are claiming. And the real question is, okay, nice idea. Now the devil is in the details. How do you make it work? How do you make it work sustainably and profitably so that if there's a pandemic in 2025 or in 2035, the hub is still there and working and delivers its promises? That's the question.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. I cut for this part. Yes, and I come back to you. Let me cut. Thank you very much.